This is a tutorial for painting plants and flowers using watercolour. So perfect for beginners, just looking at the basics of painting, blending, using the correct paper and finding just what works for you. So these type of botanical illustrations are perfect for things like wedding stationery. They work really well as gifts, bullet journals, etc. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to draw out the shape of our plant or flower. So I'm just drawing a really basic eucalyptus plant here. I'm not really thinking too much about it. I'm not copying from anything. I'm just sort of making it up as I go along. Pressing really lightly with the pencil just in case I do make a mistake and I want to change anything or rub anything out, then I can easily do that. I like to group the areas of the plant together just to give it a little bit more dimension. And then I'm just going to draw another basic plant underneath, and this is what we're going to be painting. So it doesn't need to be too accurate. Experiment with some different shapes, some different sizes, until you get a basic outline. So I'm working on watercolour paper here. There are 3 different types of watercolour paper. Hot pressed, which is very smooth, which is really good for painting detail. Cold pressed, which is what I'm using here, which is just slightly textured. And also rough paper is really good if you are looking to do things like landscapes. It just gives you a really nice texture. So I'm working on cold pressed watercolour paper here, and I'm just using quite a thin small brush, and I'm using a Winsor & Newton pan, half pan set. So I've just applied sort of the first bit of colour here. So when you're working in watercolour, you always want to work light to dark, so always apply your lightest colour first. So I've just applied a bit there on my brush. You want to use about 50-50 water to paint, depending on how light you want your paint to look. So I've applied a bit of a base layer, and then what I'm doing here is I'm just working in with some tone just in the edges of that plant, just to make it look a little bit more realistic. So I've just put a little bit of brown on the edges there, and I'm just moving it with that brush to blend it into that green. So working the way around that shape until I'm happy with it. Now when it comes to doing watercolour, if you're just a beginner, then you can use regular paper. Depending on the absorbency of that paper, if it is very absorbent, obviously if you're using a lot of water, it's going to just suck up that water straight away, and the paint will become quite translucent. So a lot of people can get frustrated when they're working in watercolour without watercolour paper if they're just new to painting, and they find that happens and it doesn't really give a very good result. So I would suggest investing in some watercolour paper if possible. It does give a much nicer finish, and it's just a nicer surface to work on as well. So once that paint has dried a little bit, you can work into it if you want to add a little bit more detail. I'd recommend waiting about 30 seconds to a minute between each application, just to make sure it has had time to dry slightly, because if you do put too much water onto that area, it's just going to bleed and it's just not going to look very nice. So I think with things like botanical illustrations, you can achieve quite a nice finish by just using a small amount of paint. You don't necessarily need to have a lot of paint on that brush. So you can just apply the paint to the edges and then almost just let the water do the work. So applying the paint, rinsing the excess off your brush, and then just moving it around the shape, and you'll find that it sort of moves quite nicely and it'll go where you want it to go. The less paint that you have on your brush, the lighter that it's going to be when you apply it to your page. So depending on what it is that you're going for, you can get a lot of different results. If you're looking for a heavier coverage, then you can just put more paint on your brush with less water. And if you find that it is too dry, you can always just add a little bit more water to it. So I'm just working on top of this green here just with some blue. This is eucalyptus, so I really want to show the blue areas of that plant on top of the green, and you'll see in the close-ups that it's blending really nicely, bleeding into that green and giving it a nice finish. So you can see here, the more paint that you take off your brush, at this point here I'm barely using any paint on that brush. I've pretty much washed it all away in that water. So I'm just moving that paint into the shape, and it's giving a really loose, fluid finish. You might find that when you're doing things like botanical illustrations that you want to rinse your brush between each colour application, which I think is just down to personal preference. If you don't want to get too much bleed in those colours. I think sometimes it's quite nice though to get that sort of variation in the tones of the greens and the blues, whatever colour it is that you're using. You don't necessarily have to completely wash your brush after each application. It also depends how neat you want to keep your watercolour pan. So I'm using just a really basic watercolour pan here. It's actually a pastel watercolour pan, and I'm just using the colours straight from the pan, so not mixing at this point, using a palette, just taking it directly from the pan, which I think works absolutely fine for this type of illustration. Very simple, doesn't really require too much in the way of colour mixing. This is a Winsor & Newton half pan. Really affordable and compact, so it's perfect if you want to take things away when you're travelling and you want to do some painting on the go. It's ideal. So again, just working into the tone on those leaves, making it stand out a little bit more, looking a little bit more realistic. And then I've just taken the tip of the brush, applying it for that stem of the plant, really controlled, taking my time as I just go over those pencil lines, following those guidelines. And there you have it, first one is done. So I'm going to have a look at the second one now. Obviously I drew the outline, so this exactly the same thing again. I'm going to start applying that paint directly to the page. Again, I'm applying the paint and then using the water just to manipulate it round into that shape. And if I want the colour to be lighter, all I need to do is to take some excess paint off that brush and I'll get that effect. So when it comes to using watercolour paper, there are a few different techniques that you can use when applying watercolour. You can use the paper dry, or you can also use the paper wet. Depending on the type of outcome that you're looking for, or whatever it is that you're painting, the type of finish that you want to have, I think there are pros and cons to both. Generally, I'll paint on dry paper, although I'm just going to show you here as an example of what you can do by not necessarily wetting the whole paper, but just wetting a section of it. So if you work on wet paper, you're going to find that the colours are going to bleed a lot more into each other, which actually is perfect for this type of illustration. If you are working on dry paper, you're going to have a lot more control over where that paint goes. So you are in control of the water, of the paint, of the finish. So you get a lot more neat, controlled finish. Again, just manipulating that paint and just very, very gently showing it where I want it to go and moving it around that shape. It's really important to show tone in your work, especially if you're doing something like plants or flowers, just to make that illustration look a little bit more realistic. Thinking about your shadows and your highlights. So shadows are the darker areas of an object. Highlights, obviously where the light is hitting that object. So just to have a think about that in terms of the object and just making it look more three-dimensional. So working into those dark areas are just going to show that the object is not a flat two-dimensional object. So there you can see just some close-ups. You can see how the paint has been manipulated and has bled into those colours. On the second one there, when I just used the water and just applied the paint directly on top of the water, we got a lot more fluid and unpredictable finish, so we're not quite sure where that paint is going to go, versus using the dry paper where we have a lot more control over it. So it's really up to you. Experiment and find what works best for you. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create some more illustrations using the theme of plants and flowers, but this time I'm not going to restrict myself by drawing the outline of the shape first. So I'm just going to go in freehand and I'm going to create some shapes of these plants without pre-drawing them. So a lot of people find this quite intimidating. They find it a little bit too scary to sort of just go in and not have a pre-planned image drawn. But I think as a beginner, it's a really good idea to do this sort of thing, to not overthink and to not become fixated on having a plan. Just going with it and experimenting with shapes and experimenting with textures and techniques and just finding what works best for you. Again, just using that paint directly from the pan, not worrying about mixing it on a palette, really going straight in and going for it. I like the unpredictability of this. You don't really know what you're going to end up with, and it really feeds into the mindful aspect of art. Art is a fantastic tool for practicing mindfulness and to just really be in the moment and not overthink things, to trust the process and to trust your tools, your brushes, your paints, and just have fun with it, not be too precious. When using watercolour, ideally you want to work from light to dark, so starting with the lightest colour and then add in the areas of tone or a darker colour afterwards. Sometimes if you do it the other way around, you can end up with quite a muddy finish, which is not what you want. So starting from light to dark and getting into that habit is a really key tip. If you do have areas on the page that you perhaps want to keep white, for example, if you're doing things like landscapes, masking fluid is a fantastic tool that'll just help you to do that. It'll just help you to protect those white areas on a painting. So I'm using quite a small brush here. It's not very thick, it's quite pointed on the end, so it's perfect for things like this type of illustration. And what I'm doing here is I'm just stippling, which is I'm just using the very point of that paintbrush to create these textures on the flowers. And I'm holding the brush quite near the tip, just so I've got control of that brush on that page. So I'm going in with that colour directly from the pan, and what I am going to do afterwards is just put a little bit of blue over the top of that, just to make it pop and to just add another area of tone. But don't be afraid to experiment with different types of mark making when you're using these brushes. There are lots and lots of different types of brushes that you can use when you're painting, and it's quite good to have a selection of these. You don't need loads, but have a good selection of maybe rounded brushes, smaller brushes, bigger brushes, and just experiment with all of these different techniques and find what works best. This area that I'm working on now I've left it to dry, so it's not bleeding as much on the page when I apply that darker colour on top. So it just gives me an opportunity to add a little bit more tone to that painting, just gives it a little bit more dimension. And I don't have to worry about about the colours bleeding too much because I've left it to dry. An alternative to this would be to wait for the paint to completely dry and then work over the top with something like a coloured pencil, just to pick out those areas of tone to really finish off the illustration. So I'm just going in with a little bit of blue there over the top of the purple that I did a moment ago on those flowers, and that's really just going to lift it off the page slightly and just make it look a bit more realistic. So I'm not using just flat colour on that page. These types of illustrations are so easy to do, and with a bit of practice you can create lots and lots of different types. They look beautiful in frames, either all together on a page or separately. They're brilliant for things like wedding stationery or invitations, cards. They make lovely gift cards, gift tags, or even just in the page of a sketchbook or a journal. I've seen people do really lovely things with bullet journals. Completely versatile and can be used for so many different things, but are also a brilliant way to practice those watercolour skills. So there you go. Easy, simple, perfect for beginners. And the possibilities are endless with what you can do with these techniques. With a little bit of practice, you can achieve some really lovely results. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for another video.